Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Good morning, co-host Suzanne Schmitt, and good morning, audience. This is Tom West with the Family Financial Conversation. And today's topic, for those brave enough to listen, is called Nobody Cares About Your Advice, and It's Okay. Suzanne, how are you doing?
I am well, Tom. Thank you, and I hope likewise.
Yeah, so far so good. And where I'm going to sort of lay up the initial part of the conversation, Suzanne, so you can start framing. There have been so many points in my career where I'm talking to different family members at different stages of transition, and I have attempted to add value with my brilliant financial analysis or market commentary or, economic concepts or whatnot. And the family's just not in a place to listen, to care. And a lot of my career path has been in a search of what's the right time to introduce what kind of advice in a way that's most effective. And more importantly, what do I do in those periods of time where there's just no bandwidth or interest on the part of my clients to listen to anything that I have to say from a professional discipline standpoint? That's basically what we're going to talk about today. Suzanne, why don't you, give a high level framing of what it is we're talking about from a consumer and an advisor standpoint?
Yeah, so a lot of interest in the last 5 to 10 years around helping advisors. I think just like doctors, they're trained to always have an answer. And oftentimes that means filling the space when clients are quiet or clients are a little bit hesitant to engage. And what the research is finding is that some of the best things you can do as advisors are, pardon my choice of language, but shut up and listen and live with the silence. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of in the research is part of that is being driven by something that's commonly called money scripts. Money scripts are the notions that are unconscious to us that we grow up with, and they really inform our view of money. And research finds 4 that I think are really important for advisors to understand about themselves, but also because understanding them at your client level starts to unlock why clients may not be ready to take your advice and gives you some insight into the family, which in turn can potentially create that family connection, which enables you to grow into the household. So script number 1 is money avoidance. And this typically happens with folks that are self-made, but they don't necessarily grow up with money. And there's an underlying belief that they shouldn't have money. And so sometimes when the advice is investment focused, people that are money avoidant just have trouble moving forward. The second type of script is called money worship. And so like the name may imply, these are folks that are very attuned to status and are going to be oriented to how to mitigate life changes impact on their status. So said another way, if a client might be grappling with a cognitive issue or divorce, yes, they are concerned about that or event, but they are most concerned about how it's going to look and how it's going to affect their outward lifestyle. The third is money status. And similar in name to the second type, what this person really grapples with is the belief that their self-worth is their net worth. And so for folks, again, that might be engaging in a life transition, they're going to be really dialed into when those numbers start to decrease. This is a big issue for people when they go into retirement and shift from accumulation to decumulation. They literally think they're getting smaller as people. They are going away. And the final script type is money vigilance. And these are the people that live to save for a rainy day. So when they're quiet, they're really thinking about how, I saved all this money, I'm afraid to spend it. Has too much of my life gone by for me to even enjoy it? So I start there just to say that I think fundamentally in those moments of change, when your clients are quiet and they're not taking your advice, it can be important to get inside their heads. And I'll offer you one more nugget from research, and I think this is really fascinating. 50% of investors believe advisors should be keeping them or helping them, to achieve their life's purpose. And that's recent McKinsey work. Really interesting body, and hopefully we can come back to that. But I think sometimes when, again, clients are quiet, they're trying to think through, to what extent does what you are offering up help them to achieve their life's work and their life's worth? So a very different slant, I would argue, from traditional advice. And hopefully that gives people in this conversation a little fodder for consideration.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. So here's one advisor perspective, and I'd like to think that I'm speaking for at least some percentage of the audience. When clients are going through some kind of transition that has financial implications, and because I'm good at my job, and I know what the answer is, it's a liquidity problem, it's a tax problem, it's a cash flow problem, it's a sell the house problem, those sorts of things. You know, if we've got this McKinsey study that basically says, you know, my job is being perceived as helping out with my client's life purpose, and I know the answer that'll get them closer to the life purpose. You know, part of me listening to this podcast, Family Financial Conversation, ostensibly is to make my life easier and more productive as an advisor. How come I just can't tell them the answer to the question? Why doesn't that work? I'm trying to push a button, and how many times do I have to tell them? Do I use different language? Like what am I supposed to do when I've got a limited amount of time? I've got other stuff to do. I only can talk to these clients so many minutes in the day. What's your response to that? Like, how do I do the life purpose when I'm trying to push the button of getting them the call to action to do the right thing, but they're kind of, whether they're money scripting or they're panicking out about something or they're dealing with ambiguity? Translate that for me a little bit. Like, how do we make it from the theoretical to the practical? Because, like, I know the answer, but I'm just trying to, I don't know, square peg it in so we can move on to the solution.
Absolutely. So I'm going to use something you and I talk about a lot, and that is mirroring. And mirroring doesn't involve just body language. It involves purpose. And so in that scenario, when you know that the client has to sell the house, that's what has to happen. What about, and I'm certain you do this in your practice, you client told me that staying in your home is the most important thing to you. For reasons X, Y, and Z, that is no longer possible. Pivoting to what is the next most important thing to you and going back to the language of home can mean safety, can mean security, can mean independence. And I think that's a short circuit way, if you would, to get inside the client's head and at least earn the right to keep the conversation going versus reaching the impasse where, you know, bottom line, the client knows on some level that's the right thing to do, but you can't get them over the emotional hump that's causing that impasse or that silence.
Yeah, that is a good place to start. So, like, generally speaking, we know about what amounts to be sort of the fresh start effect, the idea that people are more likely to start progress towards achieving new goals at the beginning of a new period of time, at the beginning of a new stage. So, you know, when we're getting into some of this active listening, one of the things is trying to be present with the client to define what their new stage looks like. You know, what is true and not true based on the previous expectations and whatnot. There is one particular instance that we had early in my career where the conversation just stopped. I was with a family, an extended family, where dad developed dementia, mom was not financially literate, and everybody around the table was trying to figure out how to keep a family real estate business in place while accommodating the idea we want to stay at home no matter what. That's what got me going with your thing about staying at home. And my job, I thought, was to do the math on all of this, reflect all the different decision makers about what the next practical financial step's going to be able to do this. But in the very beginning of the meeting, grandma said something along the lines of, well, when the daughter is able to help out with caregiving and move in, and the adult daughter said, like, I'm not planning on helping out at all. I'm moving to Florida. I've been waiting for the right time to tell everybody, but you can't count on me as being a material caregiver. And I remember two thoughts as an advisor in the room. Like, one, this is early in my career. Like, should I even be in the room? This is like super awkward, right? And the second thing is boy, everything that they thought they knew about their situation just changed. And the idea would be, trying to figure out a way to define this new chapter in their life and then redefine the goals associated with that new chapter and then move to sort of solve on them. That was probably the first episode in my career where all of my financial advice kind of went out the window. And I had a pretty good mock-up on stuff. Nobody wanted to hear anything that I had to say. But coming back to the title of our podcast, it ended up being okay because I was present in the reframing of their current reality. And while they were putting together their new hierarchy of important stuff, it enabled me to listen carefully so that at a future time, I was able to mirror, just like you said, their new interpretation of their new responsibilities and whatnot. And eventually they were able to follow my calls to action. But the mirroring and the stay at home, it reminds me of this one particular, like the adult daughter, where the cliche was 5 family members all assumed that she was going to move in and take care of dad. And that was never the plan to begin with.
Yes, and I am guessing every single listener has had at least one similar event happen in their practice. And I'm wondering, Tom, from that experience, being young in your career, what did you take away from that in terms of when that reality hit and there was dead silence in the room with that family? What did you learn in that moment? And how did it change the language that you used and the cadence that you approach your conversations with?
That's a good question. At least in my case, and I think all advisors have this different blend of skills and talents and passions that they're able to apply in the way that they serve their clients. What I learned is I've got a particular skill or talent where I'm able to move fluidly between informal, more emotionally sensitive conversation to real technical nerd stuff that is able to show off some analytical chops. What I learned was it was very important to be able to shift quickly in that particular situation. And the lesson that I learned, and it was a little bit of an accident, I was dumbfounded. I had no idea what to say. I thought I shouldn't even be in the room. Like I was watching, grandma and grandpa's face drop. I was watching all of the older brothers like come to terms with the fact like, oh crap, I thought sister was going to take care of this. And now I've gotten different responsibilities. And the sister being kind of annoyed that she was some combination taken advantage of or stereotyped in this role that she had no intention on. So the back end lesson that I didn't expect was I defaulted into the right behavior, which was not talking, which is not my nature, Suzanne. Here I am on the podcast, making sure that I can listen to my voice in real time and play it back to myself because I find myself so interesting. I was so dumbfounded, I had no idea what to say. And because, I think that my antenna were up, it gave me all of the information I needed to mirror back to all of these individual stakeholders at a future time to be able to make sure that they knew I heard where they were coming from and they knew that I was balancing sort of the analytical and the emotional in terms of their search for the right outcomes. But I didn't arrive at, hey, Tom, shut up naturally, because that's not where I come from. That was probably the biggest lesson that I learned.
Interesting, and makes a ton of sense. And if I could ask one more follow-on to that, when you think about education for advisors, where do you think, and I don't mean to lead the witness here, not that you would let me lead you, but where do you think the role of kind of advisor bedside manner should come in ways that are different than what you had exposure to and what you continue to be exposed to through things like CE?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's start with the biggest frameworks for the whole podcast. All right. Our job is to help advisors pay attention to retention of clients, organic growth, and second generation retention. That is the why we're doing this podcast. I think the approach to answer the question, the advisor's role, is we need to start paying attention to the signals on what the market is telling us it wants. It doesn't, to some degree, Suzanne, it doesn't have anything to do with the advisor. The market is going to want a more emotionally intelligent, present experience in their advisory relationship. And they're going to get it if it means transitioning away from advisors that don't get it. for lack of a better way to put it. I think that the advisor's role is shifting in the sense that not only do advisors need to be more situationally aware of where the clients are coming from and what obstacles they face with being able to articulate, what's important to them and the transition, the rest of it. But advisors, I think it's the advisor's responsibility. If you're paying attention to, for example, second generation retention, if that's important to you, if net flows are important to you, it's kind of your responsibility of looking at sort of the macro environment. If you're not developing the skills needed to navigate these family financial conversations, I think that some of those, very financial advisor, business KPI things, I think that you're going to be suffering. So if nothing else, for those advisors who I'm really sympathetic with, listen, my job is to tweak portfolios. It's not to hug it out with my clients that are going through some challenging health situation. You have to recognize that this is a variable. And if it's not you, then get them to the aligned collegial professional that is able to serve that changing client need, that changing client demand, so you can keep your client. That's I think that where the responsibility really falls. How does that sound?
I think that sounds spot on. And I think it also sounds easier said than done. So for the folks that are struggling, and again, I'm drawing on your practice and some best practices and this notion that the advisor's role is changing fundamentally. Where do you begin?
Well, some of this is going to come back to you from an institutional and a programmatic perspective. When you say, Tom, given all this stuff, where do you begin? I'd like to ask, who are you asking the question of? Are you asking the question of the advisory business? Are you asking the question of the industry writ large? Are you asking the question of the individual advisor?
Yes.
I think there's only so many things the individual advisor can do. Meaning, okay, I've got to be sensitive. I've got to know when to shut up. I know that the idea of being more emotionally present when clients are reassembling their priorities in order to get to the new situation that I can then make better advice on using mirroring and whatnot. But I also think that we need to, as individual advisors, kind of accept some of the limitations that our firm, our practice, our staff is sort of, put on us. There's only so many things that you can do. So to some degree, you start with as an advisor, your existing framework. How do I go through a discovery process with a new client, a brand new client? Well, I would say the place to start is anytime your clients are going through changes, treat them as a brand new client. You're not introducing a new process, but these are new clients, new decision-making, new priorities, new successors that have a voice. So I would say advisors should start at treating every single one of their clients in transition as a brand new discovery. That, I think, is probably the easiest place to start. I think beyond that, for an individual advisor, I think let's pay attention to where the demographics are going, the likelihood of, remember we talked, Suzanne, about advisors need to understand their age-weighted revenue in their practice. And I remember, I think I reported back to you, my age-weighted revenue average in my practice is 72 years old. That means half of all of my revenue is driven by head of households older than 72 years old. So the second thing that I think advisors can do is become very situationally aware in their individual practice about okay, how much of a problem is this? And I would offer, for example, this is what I did. In the next 5 years, I'm going to have a huge percentage of my clients at an accelerating rate go into chapters in their lives where this sort of stuff happens. So I'm kind of backed into oh crap, if not me, then somebody else has to be good at what all my clients are going through. But I think from an advisor standpoint, that's, I think, what I would do. I think it's an interesting question when you say, where would you start? This is what I want to put back to you. If I'm a firm and I know all my advisors are going to be going through this, and I recognize that the overall book writ large has age-weighted revenue problems and organic growth and G2 and all that other stuff. Suzanne, if I'm a firm, where would I start? What would I do to support my advisors that can only do so much given limited resources and training?
Exactly. 3 things immediately come to mind. One is starting with the data. The data tells the story. And I think firms are making headway. They can always do more to really help advisors understand the demographic and psychographic nature of their book. So go right back to the age-weighted revenue, looking at gender-weighted revenue. Those are all things, practice management tools that I think firms can give advisors to help them really dial into the health of their book and see around the corner, meaning where is the health of the book going? Because it does come back to organic growth and net flows. So doing more with the data that firms have, to me, is one of the first things that needs to be done. Secondly, it is not, I think, an accident that we are seeing growth in this notion of the psychology of money. There are people now who are achieving designations as financial counselors. Two resources that I would highlight who are currently working with some big label firms. One is Brad Klontz, who wrote Mind Over Money, which is, I think, a great starter book for somebody who just wants to get their feet wet. But Brad does a lot of work with firms and with consumers to really understand the money mindset, that script that we talked about at the top of the podcast. But more importantly, he offers practice management tools that firms, in my opinion, could invest in to help advisors better understand their clients without taking time during the meeting. The third resource I would put out there, again, this is something that the firms are doing, and I could argue do more with, is investing in advisors to grow their soft skills. So second resource I want to highlight is Brian Portnoy's Shaping Wealth. So Brian comes at the notion of psychology and purpose. In essence, that all money is an enabler to fund your contentment. Maybe that sounds a little woo, but he's having tremendous success helping advisors really understand why they do the work they do, what's important to them, and all of those skills are transferring to their client conversations. So to kind of come full circle, helping with the data, enabling consumers to better understand where they're coming from through tools like money scripts and money mindset, and lastly, giving advisors tools so that they can be more efficient in their practice and frankly, happier in their own personal lives and finances. I think those are all things that, I'll say HQs can do and are currently making investments in.
Yeah, that's helpful. And again, I'm hoping there are institutional listeners, because from the seat of this particular advisor, I think advisors are still doing way too much making this stuff up and discovering it on their own in the wild with live fire client transitions without the requisite amount of training. Like I'm waiting for more to trickle down for us in the advisor seat. I think the one other piece that I'll sort of close with this idea for our advisor audience, I think it's important to know when you're in these client transition conversations, when they don't care about your advice and it's okay, to try to identify in this discovery process that you're using, where exactly your clients are. When people are in transition, they're still trying to move through accepting their new circumstance, or are they in some stage of denial, or I don't have all the information, there isn't consensus. So I want to remind everybody, if they're not accepting the reality that they're in right now, if they're holding on to past hopes that might have changed given a new set of circumstances, recognize, advisor guys and ladies in the audience, like your clients aren't making decisions about anything right now, right? They're still processing, they're still contemplating, they're considering the before and the after, and all of the embedded anxiety and grief and all that other stuff makes them not able to make decisions and respond to your call to action in the moment, but they are able to communicate and they are able to share with you what their values are, what they're hopeful for in terms of this new chapter, so you can serve them better later, which is why I want you to really zero in on new discovery. There's another chapter, which is you accept your situation and you're starting to evaluate your choices. This is really important for advisors. Even if all of the choices that the families are facing are not financial, they're all health driven, or where am I going to live driven, or how do I deal with my kid driven. When you're starting to evaluate these choices, this is where advisors can make a huge impact in helping out life purpose of clients, as you said earlier, by being able to mirror back the priorities that they expressed during transition, and to express that you're not a bystander in their situation. You're doing active listening and being a support, knowing where they are. And if you're like, if you're the, the adult son that's trying to help but is on the other coast and is, like, you can recognize him as a particular, and him as just one random family member, what his particular motivations are, so you can speak directly to him because you were present in the early chapter. Like, you heard the stuff that they were bringing to the table. When you're evaluating these different choices with your clients, maybe that's when you start folding in the financial implications. The idea of, if we go that way, then we might need to think about this with money. If we go that way, we might need to think about this with money. Very important, though, to let the healthcare and the family stuff be the dog that drives the financial tail. Do not, as a general rule, start prescribing tactical financial moves while families are still settling what their new situation is and what their choices are. And then finally, advisors, when you're trying to execute some of these things and you move and execute on some of these choices, they respond to calls to action and whatnot, go all the way back to the beginning. Make sure that you're mirroring back the reason that we did this was all the way back when all the circumstances were shifting, sands were moving under people's feet, and making sure that there is a direct line from the action that we were able to do together now had its roots all the way back to when those changes happened. Being present like that and being able to reflect that back to families is how you engage the second generation for G2 retention in a way that shows you're shoulder to shoulder with trying to serve a mom or a dad transition without directly soliciting them, without trying to be sort of the creepy salesperson after somebody dies. That's kind of the way to do it in a way that can be sort of very successful. So that's, I think, sort of my closing thoughts on advisors and what they might be able to do. So back to you, Suzanne. One last framework that you want to give us before we sort of wrap up. Any other sort of big thoughts as we're thinking about the topic? Nobody cares about your advice, and that's okay.
Less a framework, more an observation, personal and from the data. And that is, when people are in transition, they literally are thinking slower. So as you engage your clients who are going through transition, and maybe you're wondering why they're not moving forward, giving them more in writing, giving them more, if you would, work to do outside of the meeting can be really helpful, because it lets the client process on their own terms and on their own time, and really acknowledges, I think, you understand they've got literally a lot on their mind, which is preventing them from taking that next step.
That actually reminds me of one practical step we do in the practice of, we do follow-ups, even in these meetings where everything changes and I don't really have a role at all. Just relaying back to them what I heard, that is a value. It's not specifically a value of I'm letting you know that I'm listening. It's just by having a third party reflect back what was said helps people process during periods of stress and ambiguity. So anyway, thank you everybody for joining us on this chapter of the Family Financial Conversation. Thank you as always, Suzanne, for bringing some big thinking, some resources to our discussion. Please forward the link, advisors, to folks that you think could benefit from this. I hope there are institutions listening. I think that really advisors could use more stuff coming from home office support, but appreciate your attention, everybody. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered in the podcast represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure. Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.